Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We're gonna give it some time yet. We'll give it a couple more minutes just to make sure everybody's got time to join us.
Okay.
And then Francis will get started. I'll kick us off in just a few.
Okay, and the additional things that you added to the PowerPoint, do you want me to present those?
I'll do that.
Okay, great. Okay, just want to make sure.
Sounds great. Let's see, we've got a chat. Oh, hey, Miss Courtney. Hi, Sheila. Nice to meet you virtually. We're having fun with this, guys, if you can't tell, our team. And I'll just let you guys know, because I'm looking at names and I recognize a lot of these names. These are habitat families. You might not even consider yourself a habitat family yet, but we consider you a habitat family. And so if I know your name, it's because you guys have applied recently to our program. Welcome. I know a lot of you guys have already attended some of our webinars, but if you haven't, you should know this is our third webinar that we've done. Our first webinar we did 2 weeks ago, and it was on financial fitness strategies for COVID-19. And it was a really great webinar. In fact, it proved to be really popular. We had a ton of people tune into that webinar afterward. The great thing is that all of the webinars that we're hosting on the Zoom platform, like the one tonight, are recorded when we do these webinars, and that allows us to archive these webinars and keep them available for you guys on demand. So you can always go back to our webinar website, or our calendar, I should say, on our website, and you can still check those out. Also, this will be the second one that we're recording and we'll have available on demand. And so after tonight's webinar, we'll begin archiving these on our YouTube channel as well. So we'll have a channel just for webinars, and you guys can check that out whenever works for you. The second webinar that we did was last Saturday. I know a lot of you guys tuned into that as well. That was a really good webinar. We co-hosted that with Bank of America, and it was our Intro to Homeownership webinar. So here's the good news. If you missed that webinar, even though we were not able to record it because Bank of America hosted it for that session, we are going to do that webinar again. So stay tuned, check out the homebuyer community, check out our website, our webinar calendar on our website, and you guys can stay up to date. And then at the end of the webinar today, I'm gonna share with you guys the 2 webinars we have coming up in the next 2 weeks. We're crafting these on the fly, and we're doing our best to create content that we know you guys want to hear. So if you have a topic that you're really interested in, or if you really want to learn about a particular subject, don't be shy. Let us know. You know, shoot a message to your counselor, Porfirio or Aretha, or send us a note in the chat today, or leave us a post in the community if you're kind of social media savvy. We want to hear from you. So. Looks like we've had a couple more people tune in. Awesome. We'll give it just a minute longer and then we'll get started. Loving recognizing all these names. Miss Veronica, I see you raising your hand. If you have a question, drop a note to us in the chat. We can help you out. All right. Well, we are right after 6 o'clock. So let's go on and get started. I will start by introducing myself and welcoming you all to our webinar tonight. My name is Blaine Cowart. I am the Senior Director of Homeowner Services for Dallas Area Habitat for Humanity. If you don't know Dallas Habitat, what we do is we are a nonprofit organization. We specifically, our mission focuses on affordable home ownership and affordable housing opportunities. But among the many services that we provide, we have a team of HUD certified counselors. Our counselors work one-on-one with first-time home buyers to become mortgage ready. We also do a ton of education, including this brand new webinar series that we're bringing to you guys, as well as other forms of online education, self-guided education, and typically in-person workshops, although as we all know, the world has changed with COVID-19, and so we're unable to provide those at this time, but at some point in the future, we'll resume that. Tonight's topic is really important, very relevant. If you don't know, April is Fair Housing Month. National Fair Housing Month, in fact. And we take that very seriously at Dallas Habitat with the work that we do. Affordable housing and housing in general is a right. It's a right that's legally afforded to all of us in the United States. And there's a lot of protections out there that you may be surprised people don't know about. As a HUD certified housing counseling agency, and simply due to the nature of the work that we do at Habitat, we are big believers in doing something called affirmatively furthering fair housing. And what that means is we don't just hope and assume that our constituents know their rights. We believe it's our job to provide the education to families that we work with to let you guys know you have rights, not just when it comes to home ownership, but also as a renter. And I'll tell you, we have a really special guest tonight. I'm so happy to be featuring this very special partner of ours. Tonight, we are co-hosting this webinar with the North Texas Fair Housing Center, and the center's executive director, Frances Espinoza, is here with us tonight. Hi, Frances.
Hi.
Frances is here. She's just not on camera. So she will be presenting some very important topics for us tonight. We've worked with Frances and her team for many years now. And you know, the great thing about the work that they do, the important work that they do in the North Texas community, is that they help provide education on this really important subject. So we've got the experts here tonight to answer any questions you guys have. We're gonna kick it off by sharing a presentation. Let me pull this up. Frances, you're getting some sweet comments in the chat. People are saying hi to you.
Oh, nice. Hello, everyone.
Very good. Well, I will kick us off tonight. Before we introduce Frances's portion and really talking about some of the specifics that you need to know, I'm going to kick us off with a little bit of background. I will tell you guys, we are going to do a moderated question and answer session, just like we did on our very first webinar. As I'm sharing my screen as the panelist, I can't see the chat. So just know, anything you put in chat, I will read. We're going to get to a moderated Q&A session at the very end. And I promise you, I'll go through those and make sure Frances has an opportunity to answer all of your questions. So please make sure you drop us a note in the Q&A portion of the app. And we'll get to that at the end. Okay, so today we are here to talk about what fair housing is, the fair housing law, and what are your rights, and why is it so important? Why do we celebrate this in the month of April? So a little bit to set the stage. Who's heard this term before? Location, location, location. Location is everything. When it comes to housing, where we have the opportunity to rent, where we have the opportunity to purchase a house, this has huge ramifications on our opportunities afforded to us and to future generations, to our children as well. When you think about where you purchase your home and thinking about what that means for your zip code and the amenities afforded to you, do you have grocery stores close by? Do you live in a food desert? Do you have restaurants nearby? Do you have gas stations and essentials? How close are you to employment opportunities? What are your schools like? What feeder pattern are you in? What is that going to mean for your children? All of these are incredibly important factors, and we know that your rights when it comes to housing impact your ability to live in a city or in a part of a city that you, or a neighborhood that you want to. And so setting the stage a little bit, you know, we know that with a history of segregation in our country and the history of the United States, the truth is housing patterns have been largely dictated for decades and centuries, in fact, based on race in many parts of the country. In 1934, at the time, this was right off of the Great Depression, and FDR was president. He passed a law called the National Housing Act of 1934. And what this act did was it was designed to allow the average American, per se, to access housing. And we know, as it is today, housing is a very expensive upfront investment, can be, when it comes to being able to access that opportunity. And so this law really actually did some revolutionary things for the era, for its time, in that it offered and introduced these brand new concepts, including the 30-year mortgage. So having a very, a much longer term to be able to pay off what you owe to buy a house, and also the concept of fixed interest, to making sure you can not only get in an affordable interest rate, but you can maintain that affordability over the life of the loan. So these are great things, right? However, also as part of this, banks and financial institutions said, well, listen, all of that sounds great, but the truth is we, based on prejudice, based on preconceived notions, believe there are areas of our town, neighborhoods of our town, regions that are more risky. And what they did was a lot of these financial institutions determined this risk using color-coded maps of cities with neighborhoods based on their perceptions of what areas of town were safe and what areas of town were unsafe to ensure home loans. All right. Y'all know that we like to make these webinars interactive, so we want to hear from you. What is this term called? Tell us in the chat box. What is this term for banks when they were determining risk of lending based on these color-coded maps? And bear with me because I'm going to look at these chat answers real quick. Oops. Okay. Thomas knows. Very good. Good job, Thomas. You're an expert. Redlining. Jasmine knows too. Yes, redlining. So basically what banks did was they literally drew on maps in red ink and marked, these are the neighborhoods that we consider most at risk for lending when it comes to mortgages, when it comes to home loans. And so colloquially over time, that term, yes, Ms. Contessa, we see you, great job, became known as redlining. And what that essentially means is, good job. I'm gonna pull this back up. Ooh. Let's do a new share. Oops, sorry y'all, bear with me. There we go. Redlining. And then the other important aspect of this is the influences, especially during the time that fair housing became, an important subject of dialogue and discussion on a national level, was the influences of the civil rights movement of the 60s, the influence of the NAACP, who were huge advocates, and rightfully so, of this important law, and the Vietnam War. Why the Vietnam War? Because the truth is there was a lot of African-American and Hispanic service members who served in the Vietnam War who came back from putting their lives on the line for this country and were unable to tap into housing opportunities because of housing segregation and discrimination. And so all of these forces started to come together to sort of coalesce into a movement as an outcropping really of the larger movement in the 60s, which of course was the civil rights movement. So the Fair Housing Act itself was passed on April 11th of 1968. Because it was passed in April, that is why these days we celebrate National Fair Housing Month in the month of April. This passage was largely influenced, actually really catalyzed, if you will, after the assassination of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated on April the 4th of that year. Within 1 week, that law was able to be passed by Congress. Now, this is not, it didn't come to be in 1 week. In fact, this was a long time coming. LBJ, who was the president at the time, he actually advocated this from very early on in his presidency and was advised not to push the issue because they didn't think that they had congressional support for this law to be passed. And so with everything that happened after, immediately following the assassination of Dr. King, LBJ knew at that time, this is the time to catalyze on the emotion, the raw emotion that people are feeling. Not to mention, Dr. Martin Luther King was a huge advocate of housing rights and was especially vocal in areas like Chicago. And so this was a good opportunity to really pay homage to his legacy and to be able to pass something that President Johnson knew would be a lasting impact on Americans. So of course, the legislation aimed at eliminating racial segregation and inequality where Americans live, and it prohibits discrimination concerning the sale, rental, and financing of housing based on certain protected statuses. Okay. Francis, can you see my screen, Francis?
Yes, I could see everything.
Lovely. Okay. So I do want to introduce you at this time, and you can talk a little bit about your center and who you all are.
Okay. And let me know if you get any feedback because I'm on speakerphone because it's just easier to deal with.
It actually sounds good to me right now.
Does it sound okay? Because sometimes it'll give everybody else some feedback and it's not the clearest. Okay, so my name is Frances Espinoza and I'm the Executive Director of the North Texas Fair Housing Center. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my agency and then I want to go over the fair housing laws and how they're applied and give you some examples. And then I also want to address a little bit of how fair housing is dealing with the coronavirus pandemic, so you know about what's happening and what your rights are related to that. So the North Texas Fair Housing Center, we were founded in 2010, so we're a pretty new organization. We're a private nonprofit group, and the services we offer are discrimination complaint investigation, landlord-tenant counseling, community education, and training. And so for our complaint investigation, if someone feels that they have been the victim of housing discrimination, they can file a complaint with us. And we investigate, and we have a couple of tools that we use. One you might be familiar with is testing. It's similar to what retail stores and things call secret shopping. And so we have our testers that we send to different places, and they write up reports for us so that we can determine if an apartment building, for example, is discriminating against a certain group of people. For the landlord-tenant counseling, our agency focuses on housing discrimination, but any kind of housing issue, we can provide counseling so we inform people on what their rights and responsibilities are. We inform them of different options they might have so they can make informed decisions about their housing matter. And if it isn't the type of housing issue that we can help them with directly, we'll give them some referrals of where they can go to get help. And our community education and training are like the training we're doing right now or the presentation we're doing right now. And we do those for community groups, other nonprofit groups. We partner with different cities to give their residents fair housing training. And so we have a lot of different types of training. And I listed the 12 counties that we serve, which is a very big area in North Texas. Most of our complaints do come from 4 counties, Dallas, Collin, Tarrant, and Denton counties are where most of our complaints come from. And we have a few coming from the other counties that are on the list.
Fantastic. Okay, so we want to hear from you guys. I'm going to run a poll in just a second, and you're going to participate in submitting your answers. We want to know, before Frances covers her section, which statuses do you believe are protected by fair housing laws? I'm going to list them out for you, and I want you to please select all that you think apply. So let me run that real quick for you guys. Okay, y'all ready? Here we go. Okay, we want to know which of the following statuses are protected by fair housing laws. Remember to select all that apply. Okay, we've got some answers that have started to come through. Very good. And I should say this polling is totally anonymous. So you won't be outed. If you put a wrong answer, you're just fine. Okay, we've got about, okay, 13 out of 20 we've got answers for. All right, our other 7, we want to hear from you. Tell us, who do you think is protected under the fair housing laws? Oh, Thomas says the poll only allows you to select one. Oh no, I set that up wrong. Good catch. Sorry guys, that was a mistake on my end. User error. All right. Okay, well, let's end. Let's end and I'll share results. So, because, sorry guys, I set that up wrong and I know what I'm doing. I should have done that right. Which of the following statuses? So most people that voted agree race is a protected status. Also, we have a vote for religion, a vote for familial status, and a vote for disability. All right, so, sorry guys, we'll do better next time on that. Let me share my screen again, and we'll pull up the official results from Frances. All right, Frances.
Okay, here we go. So the fair housing law that I'm going to review is the Federal Fair Housing Act, which was initially passed in 1968. The state of Texas does have a fair housing law, but it's the exact same as the federal law. And most times when a fair housing case is brought to court, it's brought in federal court and not state court. And so I'm going to specifically focus on the federal law. So the protected classes that were initially in the passage of the law in 1968 were race, color, religion, and national origin. Then in 1974, gender, or as it's listed in the Act, sex was added to the fair housing law. And that protects people from gender discrimination, so both men and women are protected, or sexual harassment in housing. And then in 1988, which is technically called the Fair Housing Amendments Act, familial status and disability were added to the Act. I'm going to go over several of these, but I'm going to leave disability. Oh, what happened to my disability? Is it coming? Ah, there we go. But I'm going to leave disability a little bit because I have a lot of slides coming in the presentation that are going to give a lot more detail, because disability tends to be the area that there's a lot of gray area when you're talking about the disability protections, because there's so many different scenarios that you have to address that sometimes there's more than one right answer to how to solve a disability issue. And so everyone knows what race discrimination is, and it's interesting to me that I know you were only allowed to select one issue, but 75% of you said race was in the Fair Housing Law. And it's interesting because everybody knows that race is in the Fair Housing Law, but what you'll see in the next couple of slides is there is another protected class that has a higher number of complaints over the last decade. And I'll go over that a little bit too. And the Fair Housing Law protects against discrimination based on color. And so that is color of your skin. We don't see many cases of discrimination based on color that are by themselves. Usually it's race and color together. And then religion would be if somebody discriminates against you because of your religion, or if somebody, say there's somebody who owns an apartment building who only wants to rent to people of a certain religion and excludes everyone else. So both of those are examples of discrimination based on religion. National origin is discrimination based on where you were born. Sex discrimination is in the form of gender discrimination. So somebody, for example, saying they don't want to rent to women or they don't want to rent to men. I have a couple of examples of this. One is I used to do this work in California, and I did it in Los Angeles, where there was a lot of concentration of universities. And we had a case where an apartment owner didn't want to rent to male college students because he felt like they might destroy the property, and that they would have too many parties. And so he was using stereotypes to decide that he didn't want to rent to male college students. And so that was discrimination under the Fair Housing Law. And then sexual harassment there's two types of sexual harassment in housing. One is called quid pro quo. And what that means is something in housing in exchange for a sexual favor. So for example, what's really interesting is right now, during this time of the coronavirus, there has been an increase in sexual harassment in housing. One of the forms it could take is if you say you're going to pay your rent late, and a manager might say, a housing manager, leasing manager, whoever might say, well, if you go out on a date with me, I won't charge you the late fee, something like that. And there's another type of sexual harassment in housing, and that's called a hostile living environment. And so that's a kind of continued and repeated type of, somebody continuing to make sexual comments to you or ask you about your personal life, or maybe always has to touch you when they see you. And it's this kind of ongoing thing that makes you feel uncomfortable where you live. So that's called a hostile living environment. And because of what is happening right now, there has been an increase in sexual harassment in housing, which is, really unfortunate. It's kind of, what's happening right now. And we have a lot of people who are having a hard time paying their rent or are completely unable to pay their rent because they've lost their jobs, for example. And housing providers seem to be preying on people who are in these predicaments where they are not able to pay their rent. And so if you experience this, you can contact us and we will help. And then familial status was added in '88, and that protects people. I think sometimes there's some confusion on this protected class. This protects people who have children in the household under the age of 18, and their children are being discriminated against in some way. Sometimes people confuse this with marital status discrimination, which isn't a protected class in Texas, because marital status, so it would be, say you're being discriminated against because you're a single mom, or because you're a couple but you're unmarried and you live together, for example. But marital status is not protected here in Texas. Familial status is a protection for people with children. And sometimes the way we see that play out, we've had a couple different types of cases. One is for people who whose children are being, an apartment who is applying specific rules, but only to children, for example. And so we've had cases where children aren't even allowed to play outside at all, even though there is a central area that is safe for children to play in. So that could be an example of discrimination, familial status discrimination. And we also have had cases where sometimes with these large apartment complexes, they'll have, you know, more than one building, so maybe 2, 3, 4 buildings, and the leasing agent has decided that they're going to only lease to people with children at one of the buildings, and maybe that's the one in the back, and the other buildings, they won't have children in them. And so they're trying to provide an environment that is quiet in one area and, you know, has all the children in another area, and that's not legal. That's segregation, just like if you were segregating people based on race. You can't segregate people based on the fact that they have children. And so those are the two types of cases we see most often. And then disability protects people if they have a physical or mental disability. There's also in Fort Worth and Dallas, and those are just in those city limits. Those cities have passed local ordinances that protect people from discrimination based on sexual orientation, gender expression, and gender identity. And so if you had a complaint based on those issues in those cities, you would have to file a complaint directly with the city, the city of Dallas has a fair housing office, and so does the city of Fort Worth. They call theirs the Human Relations Commission. So what is unlawful under the fair housing laws? So the failure to, essentially any housing transaction, refusal to rent, sell, or lease a dwelling. Redlining is a form of discrimination, which we talked about already. And that could be redlining in homeowners insurance, for example. That could be mortgage insurance discrimination. So any housing transaction. In the 80s, there were some big cases against insurance companies because they would not sell people in particular neighborhoods that happened to be predominantly African American. They would not sell people homeowners insurance policies in those areas. And so the group that we work with, that's located in DC, the National Fair Housing Alliance, brought several of those cases against those insurers for housing discrimination. And so that's illegal now, that they can't decide that certain neighborhoods are, in quotes, riskier than others and not sell homeowners insurance to people, because those analyses of what is risky were based on stereotypes that aren't even true. Also, lying about the availability of a dwelling. We can see that in rental housing. If somebody is told that nothing's available because whoever is in charge of renting the apartment doesn't like the way the person sounds on the phone, for example. And there have been studies that say that in the first couple of minutes of talking to somebody, you can guess what their race is. And so we've had cases where housing providers have told people that nothing's available because they don't like the way the person sounded on the phone. And then any differential treatment or different, and that can be different terms or different treatment. So different terms could be if you're charged a higher security deposit, for example, because you have children and the housing provider thinks that your children are going to cause more wear and tear on the apartment than somebody who doesn't have children, and that isn't legal. We get the question a lot about, you know, can they base the security deposit on my credit? And unfortunately, yes, they can. If they have a policy that they always use that has criteria and what a security deposit would be based on whatever credit score you have. They can do that, but they can't just arbitrarily decide that. They have to have that as one of their policies. And then any different treatment. So an example of different treatment could be if a housing provider does repairs for one group of people really quickly and not for another group of people. And so we always tell housing providers that they need to treat everyone the same. They need to have policies that they apply to everyone the same. And so they can't pick and choose what policies they apply to what people. You know, they have to have uniformity in everything. The one exception to this, which I'm going to talk about, is people with disabilities, because when people with disabilities need something that somebody who doesn't have a disability doesn't need, then housing providers will likely have to make an exception for the person with a disability. And then statements of preference, verbal statements or advertisements. Nowadays, it seems that housing providers are savvy about what they can and they can't say. And a lot of times I used to do this work in California. I'm not sure if I said that already, but the verbal statements and advertisements, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. But so people are much more savvy and they won't make the verbal statements. And now I have my train of thought. I apologize for that. Here in Texas, I've seen that a lot of these apartment buildings, they have scripts for their leasing agents. And so you're not typically going to find them going off their script. So at the point of that initial interaction, there isn't going to be discrimination because they know what they're allowed to do and what they're not allowed to do. And that's different from, in California, we had a lot more smaller apartment complexes that are, we call them mom and pop because they typically were owned by individuals who just ran them themselves. And so a lot less uniform in how they would deal with people. And so, you know, we did, okay, but it was rare, but we did have statements, discriminatory statements that were made. But most times now we see discrimination play out in subtle ways, and that could be in the way somebody is treated. And that's why testing is so important, because if two people go to an apartment complex to rent and they don't know each other, you won't, like if you go to an apartment, you won't know if the person before you that went or after you gets different treatment. And so when we do testing, we're sending in one person and then another person right after within probably like an hour to see if within that time frame, do these two people get treated differently? And we're testing for something. So, you know, one of our testers might be African American and one white, or one might be Hispanic and one might be white. Or one might have a disability and one doesn't have a disability. And we send them in and then they write reports about their housing experience, and we're able to compare the reports of these two people to see were they treated differently. And that's why testing is so important and why it's been upheld by the United States Supreme Court as one of the only ways that you can find evidence and determine if housing discrimination has occurred. Okay, so I wanted to focus on people with disabilities. Is there a way to close that little dialogue box in the middle? Or do I have to close it?
You probably have to close it.
Oh,
Francis.
never mind. I thought, okay, I'm sorry. I thought you had to close it. I didn't realize I had access to close it.
Hey, everyone in America is new to webinars right now, right?
Yes.
We're good.
And I too have been on a lot these last month and a half, and we've had various kinds of glitches. So I never know if it's something I can control or not.
You're
okay,
good.
so
no problem.
Okay, so people with disabilities, and I pulled the next piece from the law. So this is actually what it says in the law: a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. And so I'll get into that a little bit in the next couple of slides, but I always get the question of, you know, what if somebody is using illegal drugs? Are they protected? And if they're currently using drugs, then illegal substances, they're not covered. But if somebody is currently in a treatment program or has finished a treatment program, then they could be covered as somebody with a disability under the Fair Housing Act. So where we see that play out sometimes, though, is the person could be protected as a person with a disability, but then there's this whole other area regarding criminal background checks. And if somebody is a recovered person, but they might have had some drug-related criminal issue in the past, housing apartments are very strict. They seem to be very strict about applying the criminal background check criteria. And so one of the interesting things that's happened in the last, I think, 3 or 4 years is that HUD actually issued a memo about the use of criminal background checks. And so they can't be just blanket denials. So if an apartment has a policy that says, we don't want anyone with any type of criminal record, that is too broad. And so what they need to have is a more tailored policy that has, some exceptions. So for example, if you had a, criminal conviction, but it's 10 or plus years old or 7+ years old, then, they can't count that against you. And so their criminal background criteria has to be specific to whether it's a misdemeanor or a felony and what type of criminal charge. And so, that's really, really important. And we're actually doing a project right now where we're testing different apartment buildings and collecting their criminal background check criteria, because what we've experienced with our clients is that apartments have policies that are overly broad, and so it restricts way too many people. And not every type of criminal conviction is definitive as to whether or not you're going to be a good tenant. Some might be, but there are some that aren't. And so having this blanket policy is not legal and could be a form of discrimination. So there are a couple of things, and we typically refer to all of the accommodations, and I'll talk about modifications in the next couple of slides, but we typically just put them all under the umbrella of accommodations. That's just the term we use for them. But specifically, accommodations and modifications refer to two different types of things that a person with a disability can request. And so a reasonable accommodation is any change in rules, policies, or procedures in order for someone with a disability to have the same use and enjoyment of their unit or property or rental as somebody who doesn't have a disability. If you wanted to actually look it up in the Fair Housing Law, the specific sections I listed for you. So I wanted to give you some examples of what is an accommodation. And so the most popular one right now that we get, and typically people come to us because sometimes they've asked for an accommodation and the housing provider has said no. And sometimes they haven't asked because they don't even realize that it's something they could ask for. And so we have the most number of people come to us because they need an exception to some type of pet rule or pet rent or pet deposit, because they actually have an animal, but it's not a pet, it's a companion animal. And so I think everybody knows about a service animal, what a service animal is. For example, a seeing eye dog. But a companion animal, so a seeing eye dog is trained to do a lot of things for somebody. They have extensive training, and they have a lot of skills that help somebody who is not able to see. A companion animal, on the other hand, is also something a person with a disability can request. And the companion animal isn't trained to do anything. It's just providing companionship for someone. And so if somebody is prescribed or told by their doctor, maybe having a pet, a cat, a dog, a bird, will help you with your disability. And typically, it is for people who have mental disabilities, but it could also be for somebody who has a physical disability, and maybe their quality of life would be better if they had a companion animal. But if they're prescribed one, they can then have request an accommodation, which would be if the building has a no pet rule, to have that companion animal. Typically, we don't see a lot of no pet rules in Texas, but what we do see a lot of is pet rent and pet deposit. And so somebody who needs a companion animal doesn't have to pay a pet rent, like a monthly pet rent or a pet deposit. And a lot of people don't know that. And so, this is something that is, companion animals is a growing area of case law. And so, there's a lot of things, there's a lot of cases that have been related to this issue. And so people can request this, and it's the top thing that people come to us asking for help with. And then assigning a parking space closer to a tenant's unit is an accommodation. Granting a transfer to a first floor unit. So for example, if somebody, it could be for example, somebody who, when they moved in, they weren't a person with a disability. And maybe they moved into a second floor unit and this apartment only has the stairs, no elevator to get up and down. And while they were living there, they became disabled. And so they might need to transfer to a first floor unit because they can't negotiate the stairs anymore. And if somebody is requesting that because of a disability, they should be exempt from a transfer fee, because most apartments will charge somebody a transfer fee if they want to move to a different unit. And then changing the rent due date. That's an example of an accommodation. I actually just resolved one of those cases just yesterday. My client was, her income was Social Security, and typically our cases involve somebody who has disability as their income. Her and her husband were on Social Security because they were older, but her husband had on Alzheimer's, and it was, gradually getting worse. And their Social Security payments didn't come on the same date every month, because I think it might be the second Thursday, or there's a date, but it doesn't align with the calendar date. So it could be later or earlier in the month, depending on how the days fall. And so every month they were accruing late fees. And they were daily late fees. So, some months they owed $35 in late fees. Sometimes they owed $65 in late fees, depending on when they received their checks and when they were able to pay their rent. So I negotiated an accommodation with the apartment that they would not be charged late fee until after the 15th. So typically, a lease will say that you have to pay your rent on the 1st, and you might have until the 3rd to pay it without a late fee. But for this couple, now they have until the 15th of the month to pay their rent without incurring any late fees. And we chose the 15th because that was a safe date that they would definitely get their Social Security payments by that date and be able to pay their rent. And so those are the sorts of things that can help people, because if you're on a fixed income, it's really difficult to pay late fees. You may not have it in your budget. And, sometimes people come to us after being charged late fees for months and months, and, they have $600, $700, $800 in late fees, and now they're being threatened with eviction. And by changing the rent due date, if they're paying rent late because of a disability, we can help them do that, and then they won't be at risk of losing their housing. And then allowing a caregiver to reside in a tenant's unit. So, and this is a caregiver probably that someone needs 24/7. So it's someone who has to stay overnight and essentially lives with the tenant. And so a disabled tenant can request an accommodation to have the caregiver live with them. And the apartment has to allow it. They can collect certain information from the caregiver, like ID and their name, because, obviously they will want to know who's on their property, but they cannot consider this person, even though they live there, they're not a tenant, okay? Because if the person with a disability moves out, the caregiver doesn't have any right to stay there. they're not a tenant. They go with the person with the disability. So, you know, we've had a lot of cases where the property is trying to count the caregiver as a tenant, and that's not how they're supposed to deal with this issue. In subsidized housing, it becomes a big issue if they try to count the caregiver, because the caregiver's income could affect, if they treat the caregiver like another resident of the apartment, they're then going to use the caregiver's income, which will trigger a recalculation of the rent that the tenant owes, and that should not be how they deal with it. The caregiver is not a tenant, and their income and all of that should not be used for purposes of tenancy or figuring out how much a tenant should pay in rent. And then terminating a lease early without fees or penalties. An accommodation due to a disability is one of only two ways, and I'll talk about the other way later. It's one of only two ways to terminate your lease early without any fees or penalties. Because typically, you know, when you sign a lease, it's a binding contract, and so you have to live up to the terms of that lease. You can always end it early, but the lease is going to have information in it about what happens when you leave early. You know, you might have to pay a month's rent so that they can have time to rent it to somebody, the unit to somebody else. There might be what they call a reletting fee. And you normally, if you terminate a lease early, because you've signed that contract agreeing to it, you would have to pay all those fees. But if you need to end a contract, a lease, because of a disability, then you should be able to do that without a fee or penalty. An example would be, I had a client who was living on her own, and then she had a stroke. And she recovered mostly from the stroke, but her doctor told her she should not live alone anymore. And her daughter wanted her to move in with her, and so it was all worked out, but the apartment wouldn't let her out of her lease and was threatening. She had about 5 more months on her lease and was threatening to try to collect the 5 months of rent, which is not, even in a situation that doesn't involve a person with a disability, they shouldn't be trying to collect rent, because they're going to re-rent the apartment at some point. But for somebody with a disability who she didn't want to terminate her lease just because she didn't want to live there anymore. She felt like she couldn't live alone anymore and wanted to move in with her daughter because of her disability. And so we had to step in and request the accommodation for her to end her lease early without any fees or penalties. And we were able to negotiate that for her, and she was able to move out of the apartment and in with her daughter. Okay, so the other area is reasonable modifications. And those are any changes in the physical structure of a unit. So any changes in the physical structure that help a person with a disability enjoy their rental the same as somebody who doesn't have a disability. And again, I listed the codes in case you're curious as to, you know, where the Fair Housing Act is located in the federal law. You can look those two citations up. If you just Google them, it'll come right up. Okay, so some examples of modifications, and actually the #1 request that we get for a modification is to install a ramp. And so in Dallas County, we have a ramp program. So the goal of our ramp program is to help people age in place. So as people get older and they're not able to, for example, negotiate the stairs in front of their home very well, we have a program to build ramps for them at our cost so that they can age in place and continue to live in their homes without having any difficulty in getting around. And so that's an example. Installing grab bars in the restroom, that's the second most popular request that we get. And other examples, which are less, those are made much less by our clients. Widening doorways, removing bathroom cabinets, for example, to allow somebody with who is in a wheelchair access to sink better, and then replacing carpet with accessible flooring. And leveling doorway thresholds. So I think one of the, I think, and this is my personal opinion, one of the faults with the law in this case in modifications is that the tenant who has a disability can request these things. And there really is not, it's a really high threshold for a housing provider to say, no, you can't do that. Almost always they have to allow the modification. But with modifications, the tenant has to pay for it themselves. And that's, I think, that's the hard part of the law, because typically somebody who needs a modification is going to be, in our experience, on a limited income. And so it's going to be hard for them to pay to build a ramp or install grad bars or do any kind of major construction. So the only exception there is if you live in a government subsidized property or a tax credit property, then if you make a modification request, they have to pay for it. But as we all know, you know, the tax credit properties, what we call affordable housing, those are few and far between. There's just not enough of it. And so, but if you live in one of those, they should pay for it, and they're required to pay for it under the guidelines for the subsidy that they get for their housing. So verification of the disability. So when somebody makes a request for a modification or an accommodation, like I said, the threshold for a housing provider saying, no, you can't do that is really high. They almost always have to allow it, but they can require that you give them verification. And in most cases, this is going to be a doctor's letter that ties the disability to the request that is made. The doctor does not have to describe or state the disability in the letter. For example, with a service animal, they can just say, my patient so-and-so is a person with a disability, and I've prescribed for her or him a emotional support animal or a companion animal, that they require that because of their disability, and doesn't have to go into detail about what the disability is. We always tell our clients, just get that letter, because it is the housing provider's right to request it, so just go ahead and get that from, you know, your doctor. And I say doctor here, but it could be from anyone the person is under the care of. So it could be a therapist, it could be a social worker, a counselor, it could be an occupational therapist, a physical therapist, somebody who knows what the person needs and can, you know, write a letter attesting to that. So in most cases, if the disability is apparent, for example, somebody who is in a wheelchair, the housing provider really shouldn't be asking for a doctor's letter or anything else because it's apparent. Also, if somebody receives a disability benefits, if they show the disability, and some people may not want to do this, but this is a way that they can, instead of getting a doctor's letter, they can show the proof of their disability benefits, which usually comes in the form of like a printout or some sort of letter from disability that says what your annual benefits or monthly benefits will be. And then, of course, I already spoke about the letter from a medical professional.
Okay, we're gonna run a poll. Go ahead, Francis.
Oh, I was going to talk a little about what's happening now with the coronavirus. There is, it's not, of course, it's not written in the law, in the disability law, and there hasn't been any case law on it yet. But we feel like coronavirus is protected under the disability provision. And what we've experienced already is housing providers asking people to tell them if they test positive for coronavirus, to tell them because they don't want to go do maintenance in their units, for example. So that's a fair housing violation. It's also a violation of HIPAA for them to ask people if they have, tested positive for coronavirus. And so they shouldn't be doing that. But, if you are somebody who has been diagnosed and you've tested positive for coronavirus, you might just want to not have them make repairs or, excuse me, not make repair requests while you're in quarantine, for example. But it is not legal for them to be asking tenants to tell them if they test positive for coronavirus. And again, we feel like it's not written anywhere, but we feel like it's protected under the disability status of the law.
I think that's a great addition, to what we're learning today, Francis, because I think there's something to be said about moments like this when there's a lot of anxiety, when there's a lot of uncertainty that's going on, looking around COVID-19, to be able to remind and educate people that they do still have rights under this time, even though there's a lot of pressure out there to maybe offer up information that you're not required.
Yeah, and also during this time of the coronavirus, if you live in a property, so if you live in affordable housing or, tax credit property, something that, any kind of affordable housing structure, they're not supposed to be charging you late fees for the next, I think it's 60 or 90 days. And if it's not an affordable housing, even market rate housing, if the loan, and this is sometimes information that's difficult for people to find, but if you live in an apartment and the loan that the person or company that owns it is backed by Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac, they also shouldn't be charging people late fees for the next 60 to 90 days. I forget whether it's 60 or 90, but they shouldn't be charging people late fees either. That information is a little bit harder to find, but there are websites that will tell you if you look up an address if it is backed by Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac.
Yep, great point. We were going to run a poll, but we're not going to. We're going to skip through that so Francis can cover some more of the important stuff that we have this evening. We're right at 7. So if you can afford a few minutes longer to stay with us, we want to make sure we can answer your questions at the end.
Okay, so I'll just quickly, essentially the answer to all of these is no. So these are things a landlord can't ask you. Do you have a disability? They can't ask you that. Again, they can't ask you if you tested positive for coronavirus. They can't ask how severe your disability is. They can't ask to see your medical records. They can't ask if you've ever been hospitalized for a mental disability or if you take medication. Okay, now, there's some exceptions if you're wanting to go live in assisted living, for example. A requirement might be for them to look at your records to make sure that you will be okay in assisted living and don't need anything more than assisted living. But those exceptions are very few, and it's typically if it's the housing that you're moving into that is specifically a type of housing like assisted living, for example. But in most cases, no, they can't ask to see any of your medical records. Okay, and I already talked about reasonable accommodation as a way to break your lease. The other legal way to break your lease is if you're a victim of domestic violence. So for example, we've actually had a lot of cases of domestic violence, discrimination over the last year. And so the form that this takes is somebody is a former domestic violence victim and is now living on their own, but somehow their abuser finds out where they live and now they don't feel safe anymore, and they need to break their lease to move somewhere else so that they feel safe and that their former abuser doesn't know where they live. And so there are different requirements that you need to follow in order to break your lease, but those are things that we can help you do. So those are, we can walk you through all those or help do them for you. And so you can break your lease and move somewhere where you feel safe. Okay, and this is just some ways to protect yourself. Always get everything in writing, documented. I like letters and emails. I don't like text messages. You can text message your housing provider, but it's a little bit harder in the grand scheme of things to prove who that text message came from. Email's easier. And so we always tell people just get in writing, like actual writing, which I know is kind of foreign to a lot of us now because everything's done electronically nowadays, but you know, in writing or emails is the best way to do it. Know what's in your lease and abide by it, and know what's in your lease before you sign it. And if you have to deliver something, don't use a Dropbox. All the time we have people who drop something in a Dropbox and the housing provider says they never got it. And so you can't prove that you put it in the Dropbox or that they should have gotten it because they're saying they didn't get it. So Dropboxes are not very good. And then filing a complaint. You can file a fair housing complaint with us on our website in person. There'll be some information on the last slide about how you can do that. You can file a fair housing complaint or housing discrimination complaint with HUD or with the Texas Workforce Commission Civil Rights Division. But I want to tell you how we're different from HUD and Texas Workforce. HUD and Texas Workforce Commission see themselves kind of more in the middle, and their role, they see themselves as compliance. And so they're not going to be advocates for either side, and especially not for the tenant. They want to make sure the law is complied with. The North Texas Fair Housing Center is an advocacy organization. So if you bring a complaint to us, we're going to advocate on your behalf. We're also different because we can get involved earlier than HUD or Texas Workforce Commission can. So in all of these cases where somebody with a disability is asking for an accommodation, HUD and Texas Workforce aren't going to help somebody at that stage. They will take a complaint once the accommodation request has been denied. But we can actually help people earlier than that to make the accommodation request and then negotiate. If the housing provider doesn't want to grant it, we can negotiate that. And so we're an advocate for the client. We also do testing, which I described a little bit in my presentation, and HUD and Civil Rights Commission, Texas Workforce Commission, they don't do testing. Okay, and you can go to our website and you can click on ask a question or file a complaint if you want to reach us electronically, or email us at info@northtexasfairhousing.org. And I had a different phone number on my first slide because we are working remotely right now and we couldn't transfer. Our phone system is, I think, just outdated, and we couldn't transfer it somewhere. So we got a new phone number that somebody is answering off-site. So you can use this phone number while we're having to work remotely to reach us if you want to reach us in person. And the person who is going to answer that, his name is Dewey Marshall, and he's one of our staff people, and he works directly with clients. And so if you call that number, you're going to reach Dewey Marshall, and he will help you.
Lovely. And of course, you know, don't feel like you have to take a screenshot or picture of this, but you certainly are welcome to. But if you find yourself in a position that you feel like your rights might have been violated and you're looking for a resource on that, reach out to us, reach out to your counselor or to me directly, and we would be happy to connect you with Francis and the North Texas Fair Housing Center. So what we're going to do next is a quick question and answer session. Like I said, you know, we want to get your questions answered. I'm going to stop my share real quick so I can take a look at our Q&A and see if we've got any questions to be asked in here for Ms. Francis. I don't see any in here yet. So what I would say is if y'all have questions for Francis, be sure to drop them either in the chat. I'm keeping an eye on those. Or drop them even better in the question and answer section, and we can get those answered by Francis tonight. I see some thank yous coming through. Thank you for joining. We would thank you. And thank you, of course, Francis, and everything that you have done for Dallas Habitat and continue to do. I would say, again, to all of our participants, if you're not sure about something or something seems not right about a relation, you know, about a comment or question that's being asked of you by your landlord or by anyone in the mortgage transaction as you guys are beginning your home ownership journey, be sure to ask. You know, make sure you understand your rights. You may have more protections than you think you do. Okay.
Yeah, and just to give you kind of a sense, you know, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Most people who contact us, they don't even know about fair housing laws, and they don't know that they have rights that are protected. And so, in fact, most people who actually are experiencing housing discrimination contact us for some other reason. And it's when we're talking to them about their situation that we realize, wow, this person was discriminated against. And so, you know, sometimes people just have a feeling, but they don't know, and they don't even know it's protected. So, yeah.
And I would also tell all of our clients who are on the webinar tonight, and I know many of you are working with our team or will be working with our team shortly, our counselors who actually I believe are on the webinar tonight, Porfirio and Aretha. Both Porfirio and Aretha are HUD certified counselors. They have done extensive training in fair housing and understanding the legal protections that are afforded to renters and home buyers. So if you have a question, consult them. They are experts in this as well, and we're here to support you guys. I see a question coming through the Q&A. I'm so excited about this. Okay. Quick question for you, Francis, from one of our participants, and they want to know, is it discrimination if an insurance company sells you homeowners insurance but raises the rates because you live in a risky area? That's a really great question. Thank you for asking.
Do you want me to type it in or answer it verbally?
Can I just answer verbally and I can type it?
Okay. So, you know, it depends on what the risk is, because if they can show like a flood map, for example, there are these flood maps that different jurisdictions do of their areas. So if you're determined to live in an area that might be more at risk of flooding than another area, if they have the data to back it up, they could increase your rates because of that. You know, the redlining factors that insurance companies were using in the 80s to determine risk was they just felt if there was a predominant race in a certain area, there was just going to be more crime or more, you know, just more things that were based on, they weren't based on statistics, they were based on stereotypes. So, you know, it really depends, I think, on what kind of risk you're talking about. And I'd be interested to know if they told you what the risk factors were that they were using.
And we'll give that some time. If anyone, you know, wants to drop in specifics, real life examples that you have related to this question or others, let us know. And Francis can answer those on the air, per se. Good. And while we're waiting for anything else to come through, the last thing I will just share with you guys, I promised you at the start of the presentation, I would share information about our next upcoming webinars as well. We do have 2 more scheduled in the next 2 weeks. We're doing lots of content for you guys. We will have our next webinar a week from this Saturday. That's going to be Saturday, May the 9th at 10 a.m. We're going to host a webinar called Your Home Search Success Plan. We're bringing on 2 of our preferred realtors. So I know y'all are interested in buying a home. I imagine you have a ton of questions about what the market is like right now, what you need to know about the real estate transaction in the era of COVID-19. So we want to be able to answer those questions for you guys. And then after that, the next week, our 2 amazing certified counselors are going to co-host a session for you guys on the 14th of May in the evening on the subject of credit. And we want to hear from you if there are additional topics that you guys want us to cover. Okay, I'm getting a couple more comments that we'll go ahead and answer. Francis, we have a question of, what if you get disability after you move in? Are you still protected? Like, for instance, you have to be downstairs versus upstairs.
Yes, you're still protected if you get a disability. Even if your disability is temporary, you're still protected.
Still protected, yeah. Awesome. You are welcome. You're welcome, attorney. And to respond to that first question, our participant said no specifics really, but you know, she's heard it a lot in the home buying process, and I believe that. I would say absolutely the kinds of stuff that we hear working with clients is unbelievable. And to this point, you know, you may not understand that this is something that you're legally protected for. So, okay, well, we have gotten some great feedback to everyone who sent us a comment and some love. We appreciate it. We hope that you guys learned something informative from this important subject. You know, the law can be dense, but Frances, you did this justice tonight. Thank you for teaching us and empowering us. We appreciate your partnership.
Oh, yes. Thank you for inviting me.
Anytime, anytime. We love having you. Thanks so much to all of our participants. Hopefully we will catch you guys next week. Stay tuned in our community for more info on that. And Frances, we'll work with you soon. Thank you so much.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay, y'all take
Bye.
care. Bye.